This program is brought to you by Emory University.
My name's Jonathan Anderson, and I'm the Health Law Society president, and I just want to take a second and thank everybody for being here. This is a really amazing opportunity for us to hear from several really incredibly intelligent people about something that's been front and center in the public consciousness for the past couple of weeks. Professor Price approached me about doing this event together, and I was really excited, and it's changed a lot since then. Just to put that in context a little bit, the original title of the event was going to be What If Ebola in the U.S.? And so here we are now. I also want to take a second to thank some of the people who've made this happen. The JM Society has given us a lot of support with Holly Butkovic. The Public Health Ethics Club also has lent their support, both with the food that's been provided and with support and advertising for the event. And again, thank all of you guys for being here. So now I get the privilege of introducing our panelists, and I'll go ahead and tell you that they're quite impressive, so get comfortable. Polly Price, a professor here at Emory, joined the faculty in 1995. After graduating from Harvard Law School, she clerked for the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals and practiced law for several years at King & Spalding in Washington, D.C., specializing in healthcare law and pharmaceutical regulation. Professor Price was awarded a grant from the Robert Woodruff Johnson Foundation in 2013 for work in public health law under the sponsorship of the C.D.C. Division of Global Migration and Quarantine. She currently works with the U.S.-Mexico Border Health Commission on legal issues related to community continuity of care for tuberculosis patients. Publications from that work include a legal guide to quarantine and isolation law in the U.S., the recent articles on tuberculosis control in Newsweek and the New York Times. She was quoted last week in the Wall Street Journal on public health law and the use of quarantine in the Dallas Ebola case. At Emory, Professor Price teaches citizenship and immigration law, legislation and regulation, and public health law. She was an invited speaker at the first global forum on the statelessness held at The Hague in September. Jane Jordan is Deputy General Counsel and Chief Counsel for the Health Affairs of Emory University. As Chief Counsel for Health Affairs, she is responsible for providing advice to and representing Emory's various healthcare entities, including Emory's Woodruff Health Sciences Center and its hospitals, the Emory Clinic, Emory Healthcare, the School of Medicine, the School of Public Health, the School of Nursing, Yerkes Primate Center, Emory's Children's Center, and Wesley Woods Center. She works closely with the chairman and CEO of Emory Healthcare, as well as the senior management of the Woodruff Health Sciences Center, serving as lead attorney and advising the boards of the Woodruff Health Sciences Center and Emory Healthcare on a wide variety of legal issues. She's also Deputy General Counsel for Emory University, working with all schools and units of Emory University. Prior to her current position, she was a partner in the health law section of the Atlanta office of Nelson Mullins, Riley, and Scarborough, and was a partner at Kilpatrick Stockton. She received her BA from Furman University, magna cum laude, and was a member of Phi Beta Kappa. She received her JD from the University of South Carolina. Prior to private practice, she was a law clerk to the Honorable Judge Robert L. Vining, Jr., United States District Judge for the Northern District of Georgia. Moving now to Ed Shoemaker, is a police officer with the Emory Police Department. He presently serves as the department's records manager with responsibility for compliance issues and quality control, and he is the department's legal instructor. Officer Shoemaker came to Emory as a graduate student and joined the police department in 1985. Since then, he has earned a PhD in United States history from Emory and the JD with honors from Georgia State University. As a police officer, he has served at different times with a patrol officer and supervisor, a field training officer, an investigator, a crime prevention specialist, and is the manager of the department's communications unit. He is also certified by the state is a law enforcement instructor and has taught classes related to criminal procedure at each of the 3 regional police academies in the metropolitan area. Officer Shoemaker is a member of the Georgia Bar Association, the American Bar Association Criminal Justice Section, the Georgia Records Association, and the Georgia Association of Campus Law Enforcement Administrators. I told you they were qualified. And without further ado,
thank you, Jonathan. Let me give you a roadmap for us. We plan to each of us talk about 15 minutes each in areas of our interest and expertise, and the idea is to leave plenty of time for your questions and comments afterwards. My topic is what steps government officials take when dealing with a contagious disease that poses a public health threat. What happens outside of healthcare facilities and outside of specific treatment of an Ebola patient? The United States has well-developed, if largely untested, laws enabling health professionals to respond quickly to potential epidemics. Medical and public health experts agree that an Ebola outbreak of any significance in the United States is extremely unlikely because of capabilities of our health infrastructure. And obviously, if Ebola could be stopped at international borders, the use of quarantine laws that I'm going to discuss within the United States would be unnecessary. We can talk about borders and airports and the duties of federal government in the question and answer period if you'd like to, but for my short time, I would like to focus upon state and local authority in Georgia. Under our system of federalism, primary responsibility for control of contagious disease is assumed by state and local health departments. This is what we term public health authority. And I want to briefly explore with you what those powers and responsibilities are when the government is faced with a potential epidemic. My specific focus will be the perspective of persons identified as possibly exposed to Ebola. And I'm going to use Dallas as an example, I guess for obvious reasons, since it's our only example. Isolation and quarantine are public health practices used to stop or limit the spread of disease. These legal tools protect the public by preventing exposure to infected persons or to persons who may be infected. The control measures put in place in Texas by the public health officials there included, first of all, identifying anyone who may have come into close contact with the Ebola patient, as well as a mandatory quarantine for up to 3 weeks for several persons who were deemed at high risk of developing the disease. I want to show you some images from that and point out, first of all, some media hysteria that accompanied this. There was clearly no mass Dallas Ebola quarantine underway, and there will not be. But in terms of the public response, since it's the first time that many have been made more familiar with the course of the disease as well as the tools that the control measures that public health authorities have, it was, I think, shocking to a number of people. So public health departments have extensive legal authority to order quarantine, to order isolation, to order disclosure of personal information and contacts, and to restrict travel. Although the quarantine statutes in Texas and most other states permit a limited form of judicial review, as a practical matter, the scope of such orders will not be contested in a court, and if they were, a court is likely to defer to medical experts. Ebola poses additional civil liberties issues because the time between exposure and development of the disease can be as long as 3 weeks. That is a long time to quarantine persons who may never develop the disease. Logistically, it can also be difficult to provide basic needs during that time, such as food and health care for persons who are under a quarantine order. There is no compensation for missed work, for example, and social ostracizing and a corresponding need for police protection can be real problems. This is an image from the early days after the Ebola patient in Dallas had been diagnosed. The family was initially quarantined, ordered to stay in the home. And so this is simply a friend delivering some supplies. I'm going to talk a little bit about some missteps that seem to have happened in just a bit. But if Ebola is diagnosed early, there's very little risk of spreading the disease. The glitches that occurred in the early days following the diagnosis of the first case of Ebola are well known, I think, to you. The patient visited an emergency room but was sent home with antibiotics. 3 days later, he returned to the hospital and Ebola was confirmed. Now, tests, as I understand it, can confirm Ebola once symptoms appear, but they don't rule it out if someone is asymptomatic and they can't predict the course of the disease if someone is not showing symptoms. So at the Dallas apartment where the Ebola victim was staying with others, the occupants there were ordered to remain inside, as I said, and the problem initially is they were ordered to remain inside with contaminated items that were removed only days later. And that is said to be, in one report, because of a lack of a state permit to transport hazardous materials on Texas roads. Now, as I said, if Ebola is diagnosed early, there's little risk of spreading the disease, and that is why the situation with the Dallas nurse who had cared for the Ebola patient and herself was diagnosed with Ebola, it's different from those who lived in the apartment with the Ebola victim before he was diagnosed. But still, the nurse's apartment was quickly quarantined, cleaned by hazmat crew, police guarded the area, residents notified, and as you can see, there's again extreme media interest in this event. There has been one other quarantine order that I'm aware of to date in North Carolina. 2 U.S. health workers returning from Liberia entered voluntary quarantine for 3 weeks to see whether there were any symptoms that would develop. As a precaution, the state's public health authority invoked its legal authority to enforce the quarantine if needed, but this was a voluntary quarantine. Well, what are specific contagious disease control measures that governments have the authority to pursue? The first step is contact tracing. That is key to containment of any contagious disease. With assistance from the C.D.C., state and local health officials investigate personal contacts and identify others who may have been exposed during medical treatment. These persons are notified of potential exposure. They're provided with information and health resources, and as appropriate, are quarantined or monitored for symptoms of disease. I want to explain various types of quarantine orders. First of all, in the legal definition, isolation is an order that is applied to a person who is sick, actually has the disease. You're isolating them from others. Quarantine, on the other hand, is the legal term that is applied to persons who potentially have the disease. They have been exposed or may have been exposed, and we don't know yet whether they are potentially going to be possibly spreading the disease themselves. So that's the first step, is after you've identified the contacts, then you kind of have to decide what sort of isolation or quarantine is most appropriate under the circumstances. In the usual case, quarantine is ordered at home. You would not be permitted to leave your house, or you would otherwise have travel and exposure to others restricted. But there is also the possibility, it's never been used in the United States, but it's called a geographic quarantine. This is an example from Sierra Leone, and the geographic quarantine keeps both well people and sick people inside an area as one way to try to contain the disease. And this was widely denounced by other public health experts as counterproductive, that it didn't actually stop the spread of the disease and in many ways made it worse, and it certainly created fear and mistrust by those who could not leave the area, and it was followed with military enforcement. So the United States does not have any experience with that, and it's not considered one of the best practices for quarantine. But let me give you another example, and this comes from Macedonia. And in Macedonia, a British man died from Ebola-like symptoms. They're not entirely sure if it was Ebola. But where he was staying was in a hotel. The hotel where he had stayed was sealed off with staff and other travelers inside, including another Briton who'd been traveling with the man. Now, this is an extreme way to trace contacts of Ebola victims, but it's very similar to a quarantine, a geographic quarantine, because it basically allows persons not to leave an area because they may have been exposed. Georgia law specifically for quarantine, I want to spend just a few minutes on that. This is from the perspective, again, of anyone who is potentially exposed to the virus. And these are general laws for containment of contagious disease. Let me show you the language that empowers public health authorities in the state of Georgia to impose a quarantine. The department and all county boards of health may require quarantine or surveillance of carriers of disease and persons exposed to or suspected of being infected with infectious disease until they are found to be free of the infectious agent or disease in question. There are 2 points I want to make about this. First, there is no court order needed. This is within the authority of the state health department or even a county health board. So no court order is needed. Secondly, there is no provision for judicial review, which what we mean by that is an opportunity to challenge that government action in court after the fact. There's no explicit provision for that. Now, if this were to be a situation in which a public health emergency had been declared by the governor, then other powers come into play. The governor himself or herself can order quarantines, including geographic quarantines, but I'm working on the assumption that we won't ever get to that state, at least not with Ebola. These laws for emergency management of public health were designed for fast-moving epidemics that spread easily through the air, like pandemic flu. And medical experts are still more frightened by that prospect and our preparedness for that than many other diseases because it spreads through the air. So in any event, working on the assumption that there would not be an invocation of these emergency powers, I just wanted to explore with you a little bit how this authority works. Now, the problem with Ebola in this context is, as I said earlier, there is, at least at this point, a 3-week period until we have better diagnostics. There's up to a 3-week period in which persons potentially could be quarantined who've been exposed to the disease. Now, the governor also has this authority in the event of a declared health emergency, but in the absence of that, the public health authorities in the state have broad power to restrict the movement of persons, to make orders about individual persons. The Department of Community Health is authorized to close, evacuate, or decontaminate as appropriate any facility, and decontaminate or destroy any materials when the department reasonably suspects that such material or facility may endanger the public health. So what are other powers of government with respect to public health? Well, preventing gatherings, large gatherings, canceling events, suspending regulations that might otherwise apply to various entities, closing buildings, searching property, temporary evacuations. I think most difficult of all to implement of the public health power that our government authorities have are techniques of social distancing. And that's particularly important for airborne contagious disease. So I think I will stop there except to end with a prediction. And the prediction is that in the coming weeks there will be lots of false positives. That I think especially anyone arriving at the airport who happens to have a fever based upon our new, but not limited to that. So I think just in terms of the public's awareness of it, those are my thoughts. So I'd like to turn it over to Jane.
Sure. I'll segue with how you ended it, Polly. We had an interesting situation about a week ago. We got a call, and I mean really Emory and Emory Healthcare, our hospital administration got a call from another local hospital saying, we think we've got an Ebola patient, we have to send it to you because you're the only facility who knows how to treat these patients. And our physician said, okay, slow down, slow down, what are the facts? Decent question to ask, what are the facts? And, well, we have a patient. He stated that he just returned from Africa and he's running a low-grade fever. Okay, what are some other screening questions that were asked? Have you done such and such of a test? Have you done such and such of a protocol? What all do you really know about this man's situation? Come to learn that the guy is an inmate in jail, and he had been there for a day, and I think he decided he wanted like a color TV and a better meal, and decided, ooh, I'll just say I've been to Africa and I've got a fever, and all of a sudden I'll go to the hospital. And the guy's now being prosecuted. So I think there are going to be a lot of false positives. In addition, a lot of people are going to just assume because, oh gosh, I've got a sore throat, I've got a fever, I know someone who may have been to Africa. So it creates a culture of fear, which is really unfortunate. But that does happen in cases of epidemics and pandemic diseases. You do have fear, and you have to combat that fear. What I'd like to talk about briefly is how Emory as an institution dealt with the first two patients who did come to the United States with Ebola. Why were we ready? Why did we get that call, as opposed to any of the other units around the country who had the capability for serious communicable diseases and had these high-level biosafety units? And I'd like to start with we, and I say we, the team at Emory and Emory Healthcare, when we learned that these two patients they wanted to come here to get treated, there was a lot of negative publicity. When it was announced that Emory was going to treat these patients, the Twitter and Facebook and Instagram comments, some of them were just vicious. Even the estimable Mr. Donald Trump said, send them back to Africa. We don't want it here. How do you combat that? And so the message was clear among our team, and it was clearly disseminated, and it's what we live every day as we still treat patients with this virus. We can fear or we can care. And it was an establishment and a belief in that message that still gets us through. How do we treat these people? How do we treat our own staff with respect and with care? And you don't give in to the fear. So I just wanted to get that out at the outset. I think as part of the team who addressed some of these issues at the outset, I was privileged to be a part of this effort, and still am, and I'm very proud, and you should be too, as part of the Emory family, that this institution had the courage, and still has the courage, to be the first, and it is an honor to treat these patients. So with that in mind, why were we chosen? Why was Emory part of the first wave? Well, about 10 or so years ago, the Centers for Disease Control determined it needed a serious communicable disease unit, or CDU, as we call it, to be available to help treat certain of its workers who are deployed to third world countries and come into contact with some pretty serious diseases. And when they are brought back into this country, they need to have a place to go where they can get high-level treatment in a very high-level biosafety unit. And so, in conjunction with the Centers for Disease Control, Emory did construct a special unit within the physical boundaries on Emory University Hospital. It has 2 beds to treat, patients with special needs. And around that time, too, Emory as an institution realized, okay, we've got the special lab unit. We also need to be ready for other types of emergencies that may result in the fact that patients may just appear. And we have a mission to treat patients. As part of, the mission of this university is to treat people and to help find cures for diseases. We need to be ready to treat almost any sort of emergency. So an Office of Critical Emergency and Preparedness was established about 10 years ago, formerly known as CPAR. And it took the initiative to put into place plans and protocols and procedures for any type of emergency that might come the way in this community, in the greater Atlanta community. And twice a year, there are drills on campus that, pretend like you've had an air crash, or you've had a serious epidemic, or you've had an outbreak of a virus you don't know the cure for, and you've got people lying around or people presenting in the emergency room. What do you do? So it's that level of preparedness that I think really helped Emory in reacting to this event. Even with all the preparedness that had gone on, things happen you don't really expect. You can rehearse and rehearse, And when the real event happens, there's going to be something different that you have to react to. But very fortunately, there was a very good team of infectious disease specialists with nurses, with professionals, with hospital administration, with system administration to handle issues. Also, part of that team, which I don't want to ignore, were communications folks. Very, very important to get that message out to the community, to our internal governance, to our staff, to our employees, to other healthcare workers, what was going on, that we are interested in you as employees, as staff, as members of this community, and try to be as transparent as possible. So there was a lot going on behind the scenes other than the clinical care that was being rendered to these two patients in the hospital. It's interesting, people always say, well, you must have been at the forefront of that team as a lawyer. Not really. There were legal issues, sure, at the outset, but not as many as there were with respect to public health law issues, emergency issues, just standard operational issues of how are we going to get this people, how are we going to get this patient from the airport to our facility in a safe manner? When are we going to have a press conference? What can we say in the press conference? And here's the first legal issue that comes your way is HIPAA. These two patients were non-disclosure patients. They did not want their public-private information published. Now, yeah, their names got out into the press, but at all times until they themselves went public with statements, we respected the privacy of their identity. Emory as an institution never disclosed their names. We're very careful in any press conference that we gave that what was discussed was the topic of the disease and what was being done to handle it as a system. We did not discuss the actual care of the patient. If you go back and look at the tape, I think you'll see that that was very important. So HIPAA obviously is a very, very important legal issue in dealing with these sorts of patients. State confidentiality laws other than HIPAA came into play as well. Respect for family wishes of how they wanted to be involved, taking care of their interests was also of a primary concern. Other issues that perhaps we didn't expect at the outset were legal regulations concerning the disposal of hazardous material and waste. The physical issue of waste material when you are suffering from Ebola is huge, and you've got to ensure that you've got appropriate levels of a system to take care of the waste. There was an article in the New York Times, I believe yesterday, that said the DeKalb County threatened to cut off the sewer line to Emory. That actually is not true, and Emory issued a retraction today that was in fact not true. There was an issue with waste, and we had to get a special autoclave, which is a piece of equipment for dealing with waste, and we had to enter into a special agreement with the Centers for Disease Control on who would be the ultimate party responsible for ultimate disposal. So that was actually a very big issue. We had to deal with legal contracts and look into the regulations and what was happening with all of that. So that was an issue I didn't, quite frankly, expect at the outset, but it was really, really very important as that issue, clinical issue, became more and more evident that we were going to have that to deal with. Issues of consents for experimental treatment, that became an issue as the drug ZMapp was an issue. We had to make sure that the patients were going to consent to the use of experimental treatment, so that was another legal issue to address. Then I think that, so those were at the outset when these first two patients presented. That was the situation, and that's kind of what we dealt with. Once we had the press conference, we had other consent issues with respect to the use of the footage that was broadcast all over the country, where our healthcare workers appeared on the stage. They had to consent to being photographed and consent to the use of that footage for the media outlets. So, you know, our office got involved in that issue as well. Again, interesting. There was one more issue I wanted to go down through here. Actually, there were at the outset when the patients first came to the U.S., there were certain governmental agencies who wanted to ensure that we were up to snuff in the level of care that we could give. So we had some inspections. I believe they were conducted by the Department of Defense. I could be wrong on that, but there were some governmental agencies who came down to make sure that we had the capability of treating these patients. So those were the issues that we dealt with for those two patients. things have shifted somewhat, and there are some other legal issues that I think as this disease progresses, as we see more and more of these patients, every hospital who receives a patient with symptoms of Ebola are going to have to face these issues, and we're going to have to face them too. And I just want to sort of discuss some, and I don't have a lot of answers to a lot of these, so we can get into some Q&A about it, but I honestly don't know what some of the answers are, and the biggest one is EMTALA. I don't know if you guys know what EMTALA is, but it's a federal law. It's entitled the Emergency Medical, I wrote it down because I always forget what the name really means, Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act. It essentially means that this is a federal law that ensures public access to medical care in emergencies regardless of the ability to pay. It's been in place for a long time. And there, as you can imagine, with any federal regulation, a whole body of law that is developed with respect to what is an emergency, when are you in an emergent condition, when are you on the premises of a hospital. For example, is the parking lot enough? Is the medical office building across the street enough? Where are you when you are on the campus? And the requirement of the law is that if a patient presents to a hospital emergency department, that the hospital is obligated to do an assessment of that patient, and if the patient is indeed in an emergent medical condition, again, a whole body of law on what that means, the obligation is to stabilize that patient and to ensure that either the patient is admitted for further treatment or transferred to an appropriate facility where he or she could get appropriate treatment. Again, whole body of law devoted to this. And I think that an issue going forward, as we might see more and more people present to a clinic, a standalone facility, whether it's a doctor's office or whatnot, a labor and delivery room, and EMTALA actually specifically covers pregnancy as an emergency. So pregnancy is covered under EMTALA. As we see more patients present, not just in the ER, but through the whole continuum of a healthcare facility, more and more facilities are going to have to deal with that issue. Is this an emergent medical condition? And if the condition of the patient meets the requirements of the statute, going to have to evaluate, I got an obligation under the law to stabilize this person. And what does that mean, stabilization? Unknown. So this issue can take a lot of permutations. I don't have the answers, but I think we're going to see more and more of it. You've got other issues. As I mentioned, you've got the consents needed for experimental treatments. We're going to have more and more of those, not just ZMAP, but some others. We've already talked about, and we will talk about some more isolation and quarantine measures. Can you mandate testing for Ebola if a patient presents and you think, based on your screening questions, which need to be developed and be consistent throughout a system, if the patient, after going through the screening questions, as a physician, if you think this patient, I think this patient may be subject to Ebola, and I want to test this person, what if the patient doesn't agree? All right, can you mandate testing? What's the law on that? And what are the due process procedures for the patient for agreeing to that test or not agreeing to that test? Can the patient just leave if there's no quarantine or isolation order available? What does the healthcare provider do? We've seen travel restrictions starting to come into play. You've got screening that's going to start occurring at several airports throughout the country. Practically speaking, I don't know what they're going to do if they screen people and they determine I need to isolate this person. Where are they going to put them? You got to have some place for them to go that meets isolation requirements, and I do hope the airports have that in place. At Emory, we are struggling with that right now. What happens if a whole host of people come into the clinics, obviously which across the street, or on Clifton Road, across from the hospital, but where would they go if a nurse screens a patient who just presents for anything and all of a sudden determines, I think we need to test this person, and the person has the high fever and it meets all the requirements, where do they go? So we're in the process right now of working through some processes and protocols to ensure that throughout the system we're consistent with how we screen patients, what we do, and what our protocols really are. Other issues that could come in to play from a legal perspective would be U.S. citizens who travel abroad and then come back in with confirmed cases of Ebola. Do you let them in or do you not let them in? You've got an issue about respect for religious beliefs concerning treatment or burials. All right. What if your family and your patient strongly believes against cremation, and that's the preferred and that's the protocol for dealing with, a deceased patient from Ebola. That's what medically you need to do. How do you respect the religious beliefs of a citizen who doesn't agree with that? We've talked about EMTALA. Another issue legally that could occur, and it may emerge in the Dallas situation, I'm not sure, but whether or not this is a disability, whether or not anti-discrimination laws apply. Do you treat people differently when they have Ebola? Is this a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act? I don't know. I really don't know. But I think it's an issue that will come into play. Standards of care are another issue. As you know, your tort law, there's a reasonable standard of care in providing medical treatment unless it's an emergency. And the standard of care is, you get a little break if it's an emergency, and you get even more of a break if it's a public declared emergency, kind of like a crisis situation. And healthcare providers can get a little more leeway if it is a public declared emergency. Hasn't happened yet. It hasn't happened yet. And I'm not sure it's even to the middle level of care. I think we're still at the reasonable standard of care level. But that's another legal issue that could come into play as well. So I'll stop there, and just to say that, from an Emory citizen standpoint, I really do. I'll end like I started. It's been a privilege to be part of this effort and to be at the forefront and to see Emory mentioned as the leading facility, to help with this. But we've got our challenges, and but I think we're up to the task.
The law enforcement perspective on these issues is a little bit different, in part because as law enforcement officers, we are accustomed to having fairly well-defined boundaries about what we can and can't do, when we can put our hands on people and when we must not do that, when we can search their property, and issues such as that. These are all fairly well sketched out between the case law and the Georgia code, and to whatever extent applicable, the federal codes. Ebola presents for us different circumstances requiring different perspectives, and we have thought about this in terms of three circumstances or three situations in which we can reasonably anticipate an encounter with the problem in our practice. One is if we encounter individual cases on the street. Our officers or our medics or the fire department whom we work with closely come up with an individual for whatever reason who exhibits the symptoms associated with Ebola or who may subsequently be diagnosed as having had Ebola. What do we do about that with regard to our own personnel as well as the individual with whom we're dealing? That's one scenario that I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. A second is the case of the patient being maintained, the individual patient being maintained in isolation. We were there when Emory found itself in the national spotlight in that circumstance, not as primary players, but as participants in trying to make that happen, and that requires a different type of law enforcement approach than we're accustomed to as well. And finally, sort of the nightmare scenario, which is the quarantine of a substantial community, either in terms of numbers of people or a geographic quarantine, that would require law enforcement activity to enforce the mandates of the quarantine. I wanted to look at each of these individually because they create different issues and different circumstances for us, and circumstances that may not be first in the line of thinking among health practitioners, but nevertheless play into the gap between what is medically necessary and what health law permits and what can be done or must be done on the ground. In the street encounter, we're talking about a face-to-face dealing with an individual who is or who turns out to be sick, whether that's adversary or not, whether they've asked for our help or whether we're being asked to take them into custody for one reason or another. We train officers to take appropriate steps to take care of them, or to protect themselves when dealing with people who appear to be ill. We issue them masks, we issue them gloves. On a good day, we can actually get them to wear those things when they're talking to somebody. It's an imperfect system, partly because the equipment we have isn't anything remotely close to what would be necessary to shield an officer from someone who is genuinely ill, partly because we don't always know when the people we're dealing with are sick. We have someone on our hands who's feverish and who subsequently is diagnosed with Ebola, and then we have to develop a protocol to go back to the officer as an individual who was in contact with that patient and get them to agree or instruct them or advise them to submit to treatment. And that's one area of our practice that we haven't given serious thought to in the past, but that in the present situation we're finding ourselves required to. A slightly different scenario evolves if we have a situation where our officers are out on a medical call. Our job there is to assist the emergency medical personnel at the scene, whatever they need. Sometimes that's crowd control, if there's a lot of people around that get in the way of the treatment of a patient. In the case of an infectious disease transmitted by bodily fluids, one thing that we need to consider is to maintain also the control of the scene after the patient is gone and after the medics have gone until it can be properly sanitized. We leave blood on the ground, we create the possibility of an exposure for other folks, and it's our task not to do that. So that's an angle that law enforcement takes into consideration that is perhaps less evident to the health practice. With patients in isolation, our job is actually that of coordinating and facilitating. When the isolation patients were brought to Emory, we were involved along with the military police at Dobbins, the FBI, the DeKalb County Police, and so on, to facilitate the movement of traffic, to make sure that they could get in safely and quickly without obstruction by the public. We had a very substantial media scrum in front of the hospital, which some of you may recall. And on the one hand, it's a problem because it's a lot of people in a small space. On the other hand, I would say, having been there, that the media folks cooperated as well as one could possibly expect them to have done in staying where they were supposed to be, staying within sight of the story, but not getting in the way of the important work being done. That may or may not have been obvious from the outside, but it was real clear to us from the inside. Our other concern in that episode was to maintain the security of the facility. Jane talked a little bit about folks who didn't think it was appropriate for Emory, or anybody in the United States, but Emory in particular, to be receiving Ebola patients. Several hundred of those folks expressed that disapproval by calling our 911 center and yelling at us and insisting that we use our police powers to put a stop to all this. These are people who clearly don't understand law enforcement or Emory, but we'll pass that. We had a couple of folks who offered to blow the place up for us if we wouldn't deal with the problem ourselves, and that we took seriously. The likelihood that these were real threats was minimal, but we don't want to be on the wrong side of minimal anytime, and particularly not in a circumstance such as this. So before the Grady ambulance that everybody saw on TV showed up, the bomb dogs went through the premises and did their job to make sure that none of these threats was on the verge of being carried out. And that was something that law enforcement generally, not us specifically, had a hand in coordinating on fairly short notice when we discovered that the patients were coming, even though they were coming to stay in isolation. For us, the quarantine represents the most interesting, kind of the most problematic issues that lead us to think in ways that are not part of the way we conventionally think as law enforcement officers. We think of the quarantine in terms of our role in carrying out on the ground the instructions of the folks who are making the decisions. It's not going to be law enforcement that declares a quarantine. It's going to be the Board of Public Health. It's going to be a county board of health. It's going to be the governor who is empowered by statute to use a public health emergency to declare a state of emergency. It can be the chief judge of a superior court in a judicial circuit that's afflicted by a public health problem. In DeKalb County, it can be the CEO in consultation with the mayors of the incorporated cities within the counties, deciding that there's a state of emergency for health reasons, among other things. For our purposes, we need to know who's in charge, who's making the decision to allocate responsibilities and resources. We've learned that agencies in law enforcement, even though we do the same things, don't speak the same language very often, don't communicate with the same technology. We have different command structures, different methods of communication. FEMA has organized a national incident management system. In the alphabet soup world of government, FEMA created NIMS. And NIMS is designed to establish an incident command system model that allocates responsibilities and tasks and resources and gets multiple agencies involved in incidents in the same room, talking to each other face to face and speaking the same language, working off the same blueprint. In a widespread situation such as a quarantine, that's the kind of administrative structure that would be put in place that has been worked out through training down the line in the various law enforcement agencies that would be involved. We have 12 hours of NIMS training as one of the mandates of all of our officers, more for command staff because they're going to be more intimately involved or more centrally involved in the decision-making processes. So that we've sorted out, or we've tried to sort out in advance, how we talk to different agencies and how we understand who's responsible to do what. That's important because the powers of the state in a quarantine or an emergency are really kind of alarmingly broad. The Georgia Code gives the governor the power in a state of emergency to commandeer and use any private property if he finds it necessary to cope with an emergency, to compel a health care facility to provide services or the use of its facility if such services are reasonable and necessary for emergency response. This could even include transferring management and supervision of a health care facility to the Department of Public Health. The governor's powers include the requirement to evacuate the population from a defined area or to control access, ingress and egress from a defined area if an emergency such as a quarantine takes place. Having said that, the governor's powers are also subject to judicial review, which is something that Polly mentioned earlier in the hour. If a quarantine is imposed, the Georgia Code says that individuals can challenge their detention in quarantine by appeal to the court. The burden of proof is on the state to demonstrate that the detention of an individual is appropriate. Those cases can be heard individually or collectively before any judge in Superior Court in the county where it happens or in any judge in Superior Court in Fulton County where state government lives. So there are avenues where this very widespread authority can be reined in or can be at least challenged. For our purposes, as law enforcement officers, there's some practical issues on the ground that we concern ourselves with. One is the need to elicit voluntary compliance. In a mass detention situation, we have, in law the right to use deadly force under appropriate circumstances, and begging the question of whether this would be appropriate. There isn't enough deadly force to go around in a quarantine. You have to get people to agree to obey the law. You can't force them to do it. It would never happen. We have to think about the physical and mental well-being of the officers who are actually on the ground in a circumstance like this to make sure that their needs are met as well as the needs of the public who might be subject to the quarantine orders. These are all kind of open-ended issues. There's not a lot of definitive answers on these questions because we've only begun to look carefully at the possibility, not, I don't think the likelihood, but the possibility that we might be called into play to enforce the decision of the appropriate public authority in a situation like this. But we need to do that in order to facilitate the effective treatment of Ebola with the minimum amount of incursion on the rights of the public.
Thank you. We have time for questions, and we invite audience participation. So if you have any questions, I'll direct them to the appropriate person. And I'll try to repeat the question to make sure everyone heard. Yes. I think that's going to be, you'll be the best person for that question, but let me just repeat it so that you all heard. But it's basically a question about what is the duty to treat that the doctors and staff and nurses at Emory volunteered, but what if it were otherwise?
Well, you do have, you're a physician, you take an oath to treat. You do have a duty to treat patients. You're an employee of an institution whose mission it is to treat and cure. I don't have a clear answer on what will we do with a healthcare worker who says, I'm not going to take care of that patient. You've got to balance respect for that if that person has a legitimate reason not to want to treat the patient. Right now, up here, I can't quite imagine what it is. It is your duty to do that. I don't have a good answer. I just can't imagine at this institution that we would sort of tolerate that without a decent medical reason why I can't be exposed to this patient, or religious belief, or some sort of ethical consideration of why I can't treat the person. It's what we do.
But also, as a matter of law, I think that most medical practitioners can't be forced to take patients. And so just as, say, a private practitioner can, as long as it's not on grounds of that would constitute discrimination, they generally get to decide which patients that they would take. So, but it's obviously different in an institutional setting.
And it's different if you've got an emergency. If I mentioned EMTALA, if this person presents in an emergency, now obviously that's a hospital setting, but you have a federal duty to receive that patient and stabilize that patient. So in that scenario, you don't have much of a choice.
Thank you. Yes, question?
How do you address issues of education? You spoke of having to get a retraction from the Wall Street Journal, but there's so much on social media that's false. Do you just ignore this information? Do you address it? Do you actively educate? How do you address these issues?
So this question has to do with how do you convey information and how do you control social media or try to influence it?
Yeah, it was a very important consideration with these patients. With the retraction from the Wall Street Journal, actually it was an article in the New York Times, and we retracted the statement. It was attributed to us. So our communications people took control of that and did the retraction ourselves, saying it was our mistake, we didn't mean to say that. But it was very important to, in response, for example, to a lot of the negativity in the social media that was out there, the response was to educate about the disease. And one of the goals in any press conference that we had, as I mentioned, and in response on the social media, was take any opportunity you can to get at the facts about what this disease is and what it isn't. Education was a huge part of it, and will continue to be.
And I think from the public health perspective, that's the key to everything, is the education about how it is spread,
What it is not, what
how it is not spread,
Yeah, right.
and those sorts of things. Yes.
I know you mentioned when you're talking about the spreading of diseases. I know Emory is one of the 5, I believe, universities in hospital areas that is fully equipped to prepare their medical staff and equipping for treating Ebola patients, just as we see in Dallas, Texas, that having issues with that. I know CDC has issued instructions of how to suit up and how to treat these, but what can Emory take a stance on in alerting other universities and other healthcare facilities to better prepare their own workers to combat this?
We have, in fact, reached out to Dallas, the Dallas facility, and offered any help. And in fact, today it was announced that 2 of our nurses who were on the care team for the 2 patients at Emory are going to travel to Dallas to be of whatever help they can be to the care team at Dallas. I believe there was also a conference today between, and I wasn't on it, so I'm not sure, but I saw there was a notice, a joint conference with the C.D.C. and Emory providers to give guidelines to other physicians all over the country who might be interested. So I think the answer to the question is the Emory team is looking for ways to help and educate and be of whatever assistance that we can.
Yes.
With like such a limited resource, how is it fair if you get put in a forced quarantine that you like don't have any compensation?
This is a good question. Let me just repeat it if you couldn't hear. The question of the scope of government authority to put someone in quarantine, how is that fair? Obviously you're giving up rights in favor of the public good, is the theory of a quarantine. So the problem with an extensive quarantine, such as the possibility of 3 weeks, is just like you said, how is that fair? That could really destroy your life, lose your job. And it's not just that. You are publicly known, as happened with the person in Ebola, with Ebola from Nigeria and the family members and others that were surrounded by these suddenly police officers in quarantine and the public. So there's no good answer to that. And I think it's important what Ed was talking about earlier in terms of unless the governor has declared a public health emergency for the state of Georgia, and I'm talking about Georgia law in particular, unless that has happened, the county boards still have the authority for quarantine, but then there's no real protection put in for any kind of judicial review.
And I would add to that, even where there is judicial review of the governor's order, the recourse is just to get the individual released from quarantine. There's no compensation or there's no other return to the individual if they win the case.
Right, and you have the right to bring an attorney, but you will not have one provided for you. It's a civil proceeding. It's otherwise may look like detention, but it's considered a civil proceeding. And also under those, the challenge is after the quarantine order is already in place, and that's assuming that you can get access to the court. But Ed's right. There's no compensation.
The statute says, consistent with the maintenance of the quarantine rules, the department shall permit access to counsel in person or by such other means as practicable that don't threaten the integrity of the quarantine. So make of that what you will.
And again, I think it's interesting to note that this set of laws was drafted, at least from the public health response side, after the swine flu and other pandemic flus. So they're really designed to, what if we have the worst case scenario where something is easily transmitted through the air? Then you really have to think hard about how you're going to do these, sort of limit these social interactions.
Was anybody here during the swine flu? And we quarantined students in Terman Hall?
Yep.
We did.
You were here.
Yeah, I was there.
It was called Swine Hall. And those students were there for a couple weeks.
And we stood outside the doors.
Yeah, in the back there. So you.
One is the ethics of quarantining people in apartments versus single-tenant homes. You know, if it's in the neighborhood, it's just your house versus a whole apartment. And then also, just how quarantine is a quarantine. Somebody has to give you food, you know, groceries, basic requirements, pizza delivery guy, like how do you minimize that legally? Because they have to have basic needs, and then they can't go to work, and most people are check to check, so what happens when they run out of money to feed themselves?
So the question has to do with the ethics of quarantine, and I'll just give you my quick take on that, is there's so much discretion in the public health official that we really have to trust in them to make the best decision and to keep ethics in mind. And I think that they certainly do. And in the Dallas case, you know, initially there were some missteps, but then they provided them with safer, more secure housing and, you know, a decontaminated place to live, and then also, you know, with food and the necessities that they need. Now, whether the public health authorities could do that on a large scale, I don't know. But certainly if there are only a few cases, they can devote more attention to them, and presumably, you know, working with medical experts and getting advice from the C.D.C. on what extent of a quarantine do you need? Just the single room in the apartment, the whole building? And I think that they, you know, that's sort of out of the hands of judges. Judges won't touch those kinds of questions because they would just defer to what the medical experts think. Yes, front row. Yeah, I mean, the courts always have habeas corpus jurisdiction, so they can, if someone is being detained, you know, officially in isolation or in quarantine, then they could certainly try to file that lawsuit, and that's assuming that they have the access and the ability to do that. But as a general rule, after the fact, let's say there's a fair argument that public health officials overreacted and quarantined a lot of people that they didn't have to. I think they're going to be immune afterwards from any sort of lawsuit on that basis. And I think that's certainly true under the emergency declaration, but I think it's true even short of that.
And the emergency declaration actually has a provision in so many words that says as long as you act reasonably in good faith, inconsistent with the emergency, you're immune.
Oh,
I think my question was sort of similar to that. My question was that there was to be a quarantine put into effect, and there was some kind of breaching of quarantine policy. Would there be any liability for anybody as a result of that?
I really think sovereign immunity and all sorts of immunity issues would arise so that there would not be any liability on the official actor's part.
How do you address the scenario, let's say there's a widespread quarantine and somebody files a suit within that, and one of the judges in the area says, yeah, I'll listen to it, yeah, you should be allowed out, the judge is outside, or the officials outside the quarantine are saying, no, you can't, your quarantine as well, or are they stripped of power? I mean, how do you get that power play? What would you do in that scenario? Local officials are saying, yes, you can get out, large officials are saying, no, that's not happening.
Question has to do in part with the sort of courts versus the other branches of government. But a court would have jurisdiction for any county, so you would need to file your claim within a county to the county court if you're looking at the state court system. And a judicial order, then we would turn it over to the,
Courts of appeal?
well, okay, but assuming that there's an injunction or there's yes, but so an order to be enforced then goes to law enforcement.
Yes.
And what if the law enforcement gets a conflicting order from the public health authority? And that's why I'm going to let Ed take it.
That's why we keep CPAR on speed dial.
That's right.
In other words, there's no clear answer to that. But I mean, We hope not. Well, these are untested. I mean, there's theoretically, there are explicit provisions for the court to modify quarantines if it's under the public health emergency, and so there at least attempts to be a clear chain of command in that instance. But the reality on the ground, of course, is if these things are untested, I mean, we're taking some control measures that we've used in ways in the past for slow-moving diseases like tuberculosis, and trying to use general laws for new situations that come up. Yeah.
Having dealt in the past with the legal aspects of AIDS, it was a mess because every state almost was different in its legal approaches. Every country almost was different. Is there any effort now to try to find out what are common things that different states, at least in the U.S., have, or the C.D.C. or trying to do that? It did back then, but it was very difficult. It never could get similar legal concept. So is there any effort to do it at the state level and at the international level?
I could respond to the question about the state level. So the question had to do with if we have not just countries with different laws and procedures, but states within the United States, is there any effort to harmonize those? And the answer is yes. And again, in response to swine flu, following that, there's a statute, a model statute, the Model Emergency Health Powers Act, that states are encouraged to adopt, and Georgia has adopted to some extent, and many states have, and that's trying to harmonize at least how the legal response would be. But in terms of, I couldn't speak further in terms of the harmonization. I know that certainly on the scientific side, the C.D.C. is really our leader, and while they can't tell hospitals or they can't direct hospitals about what procedures and safety precautions they have to take, everybody listens. You know, the C.D.C. is the experts, and so under our strange federalism system, states and not the federal government are ultimately in charge of public health, and so it's ultimately a state matter coordinated, we hope, by the C.D.C.
So it's like it was that C.D.C. does not have federal authority unless the states give it authority. Isn't that right?
The question is now about the federal authority versus state authority, yes, I mean, the federal government is fairly limited in what it can do. It does have quarantine authority at the borders and for interstate issues. So if the president, for example, declared a national emergency, then there's no question that the federal government could use quarantine powers within the United States. And so that if there were disputes among states, for example, about access and travel, the federal government could intervene. But that has never been invoked, or at least on a very limited basis, within the United States. It's primarily the federal government's authority comes at the borders, and then through also just providing expertise. In Dallas, for example, the C.D.C. has been at work on a lot of fronts, including helping with contact tracing and advising on other issues.
I guess the federal precedent was related to smallpox, wasn't it? That the feds, because I served in the public health service in Staten Island, we would keep people quarantined according to federal law. But there's no other precedent for other diseases that you know of?
No. Thank you very much for your questions and comments. Yes.
I have a question about liability, like in the example of where, like, a nurse that's employed by a health system, or like this reporter who's employed by a news organization. If one of these people contracts a disease and then passes it on to like someone in the public who's not employed with that organization, the liability situation.
Of the person who has the disease?
Why is people are employee of an organization?
I think a lot of the discussion may get down to the knowledge of the person, the status of the disease. Did the person know the person had the disease? Was the person in possession of facts that would lead a reasonable person to think you're at risk for Ebola? Here's a question about the deceased patient in Dallas. What did he or did he not say in his form that he filled out, I believe, when he left Liberia? And he was asked, did you come into contact with anyone who had Ebola? And I've read that he answered no. Okay, well, the facts state that he helped a woman into the hospital who had Ebola. Was he untruthful? And there was some statements, I think I read some articles that the prosecutors were, once he got to Dallas, were considering prosecuting him for that. So would he have had liability? I think that remains to be seen. But I think that would be the type of scenario. I mean, it's not unlike the HIV situation. If you know you are, if you have a disease and you purposely transmit it, and don't tell people, you do have some liability associated with it. So I think that's how it would come into play.
Can you think of instances where institutional liability might be in play for it?
Well, yeah, I mean, if it is an institution, you have healthcare workers who have some risk. If they have been exposed and they start exhibiting symptoms, and you don't isolate them and you don't take them out of the general population, as soon as you become reasonably aware that they may be a danger to themselves and others, I think that's when some sort of liability could kick in. But it's very fact-specific. Depends on the circumstances.
Yes.
I don't know enough to address it. I don't know enough facts. I really don't. I think taking it objectively, it depends on the facts to support it. There may be a claim there. I just simply don't know. But I think, as I mentioned, the potential laws that could apply would be anti-discrimination laws, Americans with Disabilities Act. There are a whole variety of things that could apply depending on the facts and circumstances. I don't think we've seen the end of the legal drama with respect to the Dallas situation.
The legal drama usually happens afterwards.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
If I understand the question, what's the obligation of the hospital and the physician to treat somebody with Ebola? Have I got that right? The nurse that's in the situation in Dallas? Didn't we talk about that a little bit before?
Just briefly, yeah.
Yeah. The situation about having to accept a patient with Ebola, if I didn't make it clear, that happens if the patient presents to an emergency room at a hospital and/or the patient is pregnant. That's when the law applies that I mentioned in EMTALA. That's the law that is applicable that says you must take that patient. You must stabilize that patient if that patient's in an emergent medical condition. Okay, that's the situation where you have to take it. I think if the patient shows up at a primary care facility that's nowhere near a hospital, the physician has the right to, under certain circumstances, to refuse to take a patient. Physicians have the right to end a relationship at any time. I mean, you don't have to take a patient. For somebody working at Emory, I think it's going to be a different situation because you're going to have, if you've got a patient in the emergency room, that's a different situation. If you've got a patient who you've screened, you think is suspicious of having Ebola, and you isolate them and you determine that, yeah, they do, I think you've got the ethics of it come into play as well. Do you have a legal right to refuse? Arguably you do. But ethically, I think that's a different set of circumstances. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but I did my best.
Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't feel that I could, to answer the experimental medicine part. No, but I was going to defer the experimental medicine side because that's just not my area. But just in terms of your question about, there's no perfect screening. And so we use kind of substitutes like for heightened scrutiny, you might say, where you have traveled from, questions, do you have a temperature? But that is going to be imperfect given that we have no test until symptoms are shown that would confirm Ebola, and that there's a long period of time, there's 3 weeks. And I think it's that combination of those two factors that creates a problem that we don't have an answer to, which is there's no perfect screening system, and there's not going to be one at the airports, and there's not going to be one for health workers going into facilities, even if they have traveled. I mean, the abundance of caution would be, or not the abundance of caution, but the only other possibility is to shut down travel completely, which you cannot do, or at least the World Health Organization has said that's really contributed to the crisis in West Africa, is that all of those countries have basically shut their borders to each other. And so that actually makes things worse. So basically, again, I can't speak to the experimental medicine question that you had. I think it's an important one, but just in terms of screening, those were the thoughts I had. I don't know if any of my panelists have others.
Only to the extent that the kind of crowd control that would be required as a substitute for relying on screening is just not a practical possibility to either keep healthcare providers in a facility and family members out is, I think, an investment of resources that nobody's prepared to make.
We have time for one more question. Yes. Well, in terms of federal quarantine authority, the C.D.C. quarantine stations at many border points and ports of entry, like major airports, they have the authority. And if it comes to their attention either because the airlines alert that they have a sick passenger or because a Border Patrol or an immigration authority has identified a passenger or a passenger self-identifies. So they have the authority there to put them in isolation, order isolation, and at that point, at the point of entry. And then within that, afterwards, it's a state issue. You know, it's a state responsibility once the person has entered the United States. Okay, any final thoughts by our panelists? I want to thank them very much for the time that they have devoted to this, and also to you for your attendance. And we'll be around for, or at least I've volunteered myself, but we should be around for questions if you would like to see us afterwards. Thank you.
That's okay. That's okay.